Consciousness is a primary reality that is not amenable to materialist explanation. Freedom is incompatible with metaphysical materialism, whether deterministic or not. Rationalism is incompatible with either materialism or dualism, since both eliminate rationality from the material world. Dualism is the default position of most Marxists committed to materialist monism, since in its modern sense, dualism is the historical product of the mechanistic expulsion of mind from matter. Plato and Augustine were dualists of a different kind. Dialectical equivocity doesn't get us out of this bind, since it either preserves two substances, mind and matter, as dually distinct but internally related, or, by applying laws specific to conceptual development to the natural world, brings us closer to idealist monism. To these provocations I add one more. Marxism is proletarian idealism.
Hello and welcome to the Regrettable Century. It's the dudes minus Kevin plus Daniel. And we are here to talk about an article by Richard Seymour that was on his Substack. Was it also in Salvage? I don't remember. Or no, it's on his Patreon. There we go. Sorry. Called Dual and Duality, or Degrowth and Dialectics. And he uses some criticisms of Kohei Saito's book on degrowth communism as a sort of tee-off for his conversation, but it's only sort of incidental to the whole conversation. Ben, I believe you had a setup for us.
Yeah, so the Saito is basically like a case study to delve into this deeper exposition of, I guess, a long-standing debate on metaphysical materialism versus idealism, and Seymour's just complicating everything, also clarifying everything. He's clarifying everything by complicating everything, or vice versa. And
he's clarifying everything like Hegel clarifies.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And we have a pretty good Hegel group here today. We're joined by Daniel.
Hello.
In lieu of Kevin. Kevin would have been great, Kevin.
Stupid Kevin.
Yeah.
Don't worry, you can say bad things about Kevin because he's not here, and he will never know.
Right. That's right. Yeah. The passage that we heard just prior to your introduction is Seymour's opening statement for this essay that he published on his blog in April 20th, 2023. And that kind of is the key into the essay at large. Like we said, Saito's work, Marx and the Anthropocene, which I have not read, but I've heard discussed, is sort of the case study.
You either really hate it, or you really love it, or you think that it's okay. That's what I've heard so far.
Yeah. I believe Varn was doing a reading group on it, and actually had, what's his name? John Bellamy Foster onto his show to discuss and critique it. They both don't like it. I think Saito's wrong. One of the things that Seymour's
Red Library did one also.
Really?
And yeah, that was, I think, one of the last books that they did before they went off air. And Adam really liked it, if I remember correctly.
Seymour says that the critics have perhaps valid criticisms, but they're wrong about what Saito's wrong about, which I guess we'll get into. But in this opening statement, he introduces a few things I think we should just define for our listeners. Dualism. He says that's the default position of most Marxists who are committed to materialist monism, which we should also probably define. And metaphysical materialism. Those three, I think, are good beginning points. one of you want to
So
do that?
dualism is easy to define, and that's just the idea that reality is made up of two different types of substances, right? So like there's specifically, I think mind and body dualism is the one that most often pops up in modern philosophical discourse. And I think that what Seymour's dealing with here is the idea that there is a duality between nature and society that is implied, that he argues against. And there's also metaphysical dualism.
He argues against it, or at least he argues against the fact that it isn't recognized by Marxists as such. He sees the necessity of it, which we'll get to, but he's basically pointing out the contradictions and lack of self-perception of Marxists as holding an idealist position.
Right. So, and essentially, he contests that Marxists see themselves as monists while actually being dualists.
Yeah.
We should define monism now.
Well, okay.
Monism is the opposite of dualism.
Right. It's the denial of a distinction between mind and matter, distinction between the material and the spiritual, or the material and the ideal. I want to complicate things a little bit further, because it's not on your list of things that we should define. But I feel like it's just important to, well, I guess maybe it isn't, whatever. When people say materialism, they say, well, I'm a Marxist because I'm a materialist. And it's like, that's not in Marx. That's just not. Marx has a materialist conception of history. That's it. Now, Marx happens to be an atheist and thus rejects a certain conception of that distinction between the spiritual and the material or whatever. But he's not like an advocate of a philosophy of materialism. That's the later edition, and it really confuses things. It really complicates things unnecessarily. Because I, as a very, very believing, very firmly believing Catholic, have a materialist conception of history.
Yes. And I'm also... We all do.
And I'm also not an atheist.
Right. But that also brings us, in a specific sense, is dualism. And and Seymour sees the utility of, or the usefulness of, or the necessity, rather, of that dualism. But we have to call it what it is. So we also are, what's often missing from Marxist materialists is the actual understanding that materialism is in and of itself a metaphysical position, which that's obvious, but that seems to be missing. People presume that materialism is something that subdues all metaphysics.
Right.
But that's not the case.
I mean, this is you can see this kind of in the germ of materialist thought in ancient Greece. Like the pre-Socratic philosophers, I would argue a lot of them were monist materialists, forgetting the exact names of them, but like one thought that the world was all fire, one thought the world was all water, right? Those are like materialist monists, positing like there's this one substance that is at the base of all reality and material reality. But what were you just saying, Ben? I just lost track. But
just that materialism is a metaphysics, but also what you're saying is reminding me of something we get to later when he introduces Laclau, who quotes Hegel as maintaining that materialism had historically been one of the first forms of idealism.
Right. So this is the point that that idea is an idea, that the world is made of one material substance, which is fire. That's an abstract concept on which is based.
As is
material
monism.
Yeah.
Yeah. These are abstract conceptions being applied to the material. This reminds me, incidentally, of when I was trying to read Bogdanov at some point, who actually saw this problem, and he saw that historical materialism is actually an ontological framing, and so he kind of, I forget what he called it, but his alternative was something that was more sort of radically empiricist, and sort of overcame objective reality as such, which is pretty wild. Not sure how successfully he did that. The closing of the opening statement, he says that dialectical equivocity doesn't get us out of this bind. And I feel like that's a sort of dance we are often engaged in as Marxists and Marxologists, is just basically sidestepping the problem dialectically.
Well, there's also like even the drift from the materialist conception of history to a broader philosophical framework of historical materialism. Even that's dicey, and even that they're used interchangeably, and it's not quite the same thing. A materialist conception of history is just the recognition that things that happen in the material world are where we get our ideas about what we should do in the material world. That's it. Historical materialism is a broader philosophical framework that I think does a lot more work than I think than it should. And it's like, this is historical materialist, or that is not historical materialist. And that even gets further complicated when people say dialectical materialism. Like, that's just, these are words that Karl Marx never even used together in the same way, in the same dialectical materialism did not exist for Karl Marx.
But it was an official. It was the official metaphysics of Stalinism.
Yeah, very much so.
Diamat.
Yeah. So the materialist conception of history, or I would say a materialist conception of history, that much Karl Marx would defend and can be said to be a part of what we could call the thought of Karl Marx, or what has become known as Marxism. All of the rest of that are all just further drifts from and absorptions of other concepts up to the point where it starts to be a different thing.
So, I mean, and Marx's conception of history, the historical or the materialist conception of history, ends up in historiography being sort of the default method of understanding history. Like, material concerns, material forces, material conditions are the reason why historical events happen, right? And you can break it down even further and get to production, right? Production being the production and extraction being the two drivers behind historical changes. And a lot more people than Marxists accept that as well. So, I mean, I think that holding a materialist conception of history is not anything, it has almost nothing to do with atheism and materialism, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And specifically what Marx means too is the specific history of class conflict, right? That is also what material, it's not just any material conditions of history. It is, that's his phrase and philosophical reasoning for what politically gets expressed as class conflict and class consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
And within that are these ideas of base and superstructure and everything else, which are not even completely agreed upon by other historical materialists.
Right.
And which aren't a doctrine either. It's like it's just like a pet peeve when people like refer to those as like, oh, if we could just analyze the base, this will reveal the super. It's like, no, I don't think so.
Well, this essay is holding under the microscope all sorts of doctrine, and included in that is the sort of rebuffing or the criticism of Engels' dialectics of nature, right, which is moving Marx's original conception of what Jason defined earlier as the study of history according to materialist framework into something much bigger. And I think Lukács also, he gets into how Lukács critiqued Engels' move there as a misstep. But Seymour says it's more complicated than that. And even contradictions can't be reduced to class conflict. I just want to kind of round out our sort of inspection of this opening statement by reading the second half of it again. Dialectical equivocity doesn't get us out of this bind of dualism, since it either preserves two substances, mind and matter, as duly distinct but internally related, or by applying laws specific to conceptual development to the natural world, brings us closer to idealist monism. So there we have materialist monism versus idealist monism. We could probably say a word or two about that. And finally, to these provocations, he says, I add one more. Marxism is proletarian idealism. So, big move.
And I think that statement will ruffle some feathers.
Big time.
But I think it's entirely, it's supported very well throughout the article, but it's also just like on the face of it, it's just easy to accept if you first accept that materialism is not the philosophy of Marxism, which is the thought of Karl Marx handed down throughout the ages. It's like if you abandon this Talmudic conceptions of what a person's thought is, basically, if you stop being so idealist about it and you start being a little bit more materialist about what that means, then it's easy to accept, I think.
Stop treating Marxism as a static, textual, philosophical tradition and engage with the actual substance of the philosophy itself and the argument itself, which I have to bring this up now because it's a perfect time. It's mirroring exactly what Jason is saying. But this amazing book, which I just gifted Ben, actually, The Philosophy of Marx by Etienne Balibar. The first chapter is called Marxist Philosophy or Marx's Philosophy. And it's exactly his point, which is that the philosophy of Marx and actually treating Marx as a philosopher, which doesn't diminish him or take away from, anything else we might want to do with Marx or call Marx, that the philosophy is actually much more complex and interesting and engaging than this thing when we try to make it one thing or make it concrete in this one direction. That's kind of the whole brilliance of the philosophy itself, is that it can't be pinned down.
Right.
It's full of complications and ambiguities, and I read that as a feature, not a bug.
Right. Yeah, Marx's engagement with idealism is more than just overcoming it by turning Hegel on his head. And it's like, bye, idealism. Thanks for everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's an oversimplification to the point of being a different series of conceptions than was ever originally intended. Throughout the years, I have said it's very valuable, and we do need a broadly populist republicanism into which a broadly democratic socialism can be, out of which a socialist approach to democracy can be cultivated, and into which a broadly vulgar Marxism can be injected, out of which can eventually become a properly dialectical understanding of a communist praxis. But in lieu of all of that, we just have the broadly vulgar Marxism.
And I was going to say, converse to Marxism not being this Talmudic thing, it's also not to be reduced to kind of empiricism or positivist scientism, of course, but it relies on idealist categories. So it can never be that.
Right.
To try and do that would erase his main contributions. Capital would not have been written, could not have been written without those categories.
Well, yeah, because there is a desire for idealism to have been defeated. The idea that mental constructs can be just done away with, and that's only in the material world that ideas even come from, rather than a recognition of the interplay between an idealist construction of a thing that comes up against material reality, or what Hegel calls the confrontation with the moment of truth, from which elaborations of that original idealist conception is there. Those are further developed and acted upon the world again, and vice versa. Like when Marx and Marx's brand of communism is intending to be dialectical and in service of a materialist conception of history, it does not maintain that ideas have no bearing on material reality, but rather that there is a back and forth and a constant interplay between the two.
Well, how does capital
there's
begin?
that one part of Marx where he says that capitalism is just a social construct anyway.
Oh, right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
But how does he begin capital? How does he begin to look at the commodity? He begins from an abstract and moves into the concrete.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not the other way around.
Right.
Yeah. That's the episode. Play it out.
Well, I have this passage.
Go for it.
So I wanted to hold off in case anyone had any other things to say, because I just wanted to read part from the Balabar book. I put it in the notes. It's just like 2 pages called The Two Sides of Idealism. And I think it points to exactly what we're talking about here and what Seymour means by proletarian idealism. So I just wanted to read part of it, not the whole thing, but
do it.
I think it also might just be the answer to the episode and we can be done. I'll skip around, but this is from the Balabar book about the two sides of idealism. He says, Marx's materialism has nothing to do with a reference to matter, and this will remain the case for a long time until Engels undertakes to reunite Marxism with the natural sciences, which Seymour references. So, we are dealing with a strange materialism without matter. Why, then, is this term used? And he gives a few reasons. One of them is that if Marx declared that it was a principle of materialism to change the world, seeking at the same time to differentiate his position from all existing materialism, which he calls old materialism, and which depends precisely on the idea that everything has ultimately to be explained in terms of matter. If he did this, this was clearly in order to take the contrary stance to that of idealism. The key to Marx's formulations resides not in the word materialism, but in the term idealism. And then he says, once again, we must ask why this should be. He gives a couple reasons, but the part that's compelling is farther down here. The function of idealism in modern philosophy, whether one speaks of consciousness, spirit, or reason, these categories which express the universal always have two sides to them. They ultimately and intimately combine two ideas, representation and subjectivity. This is kind of echoing what Jason was saying. It is precisely the originality and strength of the great idealist tradition that it thought this combination through systematically. Mm-hmm. So then Balabar goes on to say that in Marx, it was precisely the work that the idealist philosophical tradition did around these concepts of representation and subjectivity, or as like what Seymour is calling consciousness.
Yeah.
That you don't get Marxism without those insights. And Marx's philosophy doesn't make sense without that idealism underpinning it. But then I don't think he's being dualist here, but he says that they're interrelated. Basically, one means the other. And just this quote, so he's talking about like how subjectivity implies sort of conscious activity. Marx thought that the subjective activity of which idealism speaks is at bottom the trace, the denegation of a more real activity, an activity that is more effective, an activity which would be at the same time the constitution of the external world and the formation or transformation of the self. All in all, then, it is not difficult to derive the following hypothesis from Marx. Just as traditional materialism in reality conceals an idealist foundation, so modern idealism in reality conceals a materialist orientation in the function it attributes to the acting subject. And what he proposes is quite simply to explode this contradiction, to disassociate representation and subjectivity, and allow the category of practical activity as such to emerge in its own right. So that's a lot of text, but I love how he concludes that by saying, for Marx, like this is also part of the point that Marx is one of the first thinkers to be exploding the contradiction, right? It's not that he's like creating some new doctrine, or he's just kind of like saying what hasn't been said before in a new way, which is that all of idealism previously had taken for granted that there's like a material, historical, lived reality to the claims they're making.
Right.
And the reverse, which is that materialism has been based on abstract ideas. And I think it's like, this is just like such a simple but profound point about like, what is Marx trying to do? Explode the contradiction. I love that.
Like,
it's like,
in the past, whenever I have tried to wade through this in a very clumsy way, because I was using materialist and idealist in the older sense, not in the older sense, in the vulgarized sense, in the way I understood them in a different time in my life. And I would say things like, Hegel was maybe more materialist than we want to believe. It's like, actually, it's not that. It's just that German idealism is more compatible with the materialist conception of history than we want to believe, because we don't want to bother with what it says. But it's actually not the case that Hegel's materialist. It's just that Hegel's idealism is compatible. Hegel's idealism is compatible with. Somebody has a very loud siren.
I'm sorry, I can't stop the siren. I'll mute myself.
Okay. I guess all I was trying to say is that when Hegel's idealism is in fact very compatible with the materialist conception of history.
Right.
Ben, you don't have to stay muted the whole time, just during the siren.
Perhaps we should move on through.
What, past the introduction?
But I sort of, to tie in the passage from Balabar to Seymour, I think this idea of proletarian idealism sort of means this idea of practical activity as such to emerge in its own right. So it's not a dualism and it's either or. I don't know, maybe we don't even have to use the word dialectical if that is too confusing too. It just means like ideas influence the matter and the history and vice versa. Like the stream goes both ways. I think that's what he's saying. Yeah. And the focus is on, Marx is the first thinker to try to philosophize and politicize this idea of practical activity as such, and socially and class-based. So we're not just talking about the individual mind and body. We're talking about social relations and society and history and how everything relates. So I do feel like that's Seymour's jumping off point for ecological considerations, which we haven't even got to. We'll talk about later. But
yeah, maybe on that note, we should move on to his, he kind of rehearses Saito's argument before he begins his critique, both of Saito himself and of Saito's critics. He says that critics are wrong about where the chief problem lies with Saito. Saito's argument is basically Marx is abandoning historical materialism to go beyond capital. And also that Marx was disfigured by Engels in the Dialectics of Nature, which Jason probably has some thoughts on. And basically asking, I think, a very prescient question about whether capitalism was necessary for socialism. He looks at Marx's the what's been deemed socialist communal abundance.
You gonna pronounce the German?
No, I'm going to let Chris or you do that. That's a really long German word.
I kind of want to hear it pronounced.
Chris, can you pronounce this word, Chris?
Genossenschaftlicher Reichtum.
Ooh, that was worth the wait.
Yeah.
Chris,
Socialist communal abundance. Genossenschaftlicher Reichtum.
Yeah. So that's something that apparently Marx was becoming really interested in after writing Capital. And Saito is kind of using previously unpublished notes and kind of scant texts to build his argument that Marx was abandoning historical materialism, which Seymour thinks is maybe a bridge too far. But
yeah, I'm pretty skeptical. I haven't read the Saito, but I've read a bit around it, and I don't know. I don't place that much stock in like the sort of philological, if we want to call it that, like extrapolations that even stuff about the earlier epistemological break Marx supposedly went through. I'm just like, I don't know. I think it's probably more complicated. I don't feel like a couple of quotes from journals reveals like a new understanding. That said, I do, if it's like an excuse to do some creative reinterpretation, I'm all for that, but I don't place that much stock in like this is what it really means now.
Yeah, I have a couple of different things that I want to, Ben, in your notes, the abandoning of historical materialism to go to Capital. I'm not quite convinced. That's not probably the harder one to decipher, to discuss. The easier one is Marx is being disfigured by Engels. And rather than saying Marx is disfigured by Engels and trying to defend Marx against Engels, what I would say is that the works of dialectics of nature does a disservice to the comprehension of the dialectical laws or dialectical thinking as it applies to human society, because the subjective factor of human agency, of human will, and thus this idealist conception of human beings conjuring into existence by virtue of taking their ideas and trying to make them manifest in the material world cooperatively, is basically shunted aside. And now the dialectics of nature, at least is the best I can remember, is that dialectical movement is reduced to evolution. Just like this is just a process that just happens in nature. It's actually a far, I think, less of materialist conception than people think it is.
Right.
And then the last one is I put this note. It says they think, I don't know who they is because I forgot. But it says they think that Saito's degrowth communism strips Marx down to the level of romantic socialism. And I just said, so?
Yeah.
The critics of Saito is they.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if they are they're saying that, but what Saito is trying to do is romanticize Marx. I say, so what? Like, maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's not wrong. But that's not quite the gotcha that I think people want it to be. It's like this idea that Marx's socialism is romantic instead of scientific. Well, that only has meaning if you think in terms of idealism versus materialism as, again, this previous, I think, intellectual error, which really kind of undergirds everything going forward from that point.
The epistemological break debate between, from Marx to Engels, I think is entirely incorrect. Like the framework of the debate is wrong, because Marx's writings are ambiguous enough so that you can, infer Engels from it, or you can seize on his more humanist and romantic writings to infer something else. So the argument isn't whether or not Marx would have said this it's so fucking what he would have said. Let's choose to emphasize the things that we think are correct. Right. And I think that Engels was incorrect in emphasizing these portions of Marx. You know, Mark. Good old Mark.
It's just my neighbor. I can grasp my neighbor what he thinks.
Yeah.
Actually,
no, but
speaking of being grasping. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. So, choosing to seize upon portions of Marx that people have chosen to seize upon, and to emphasize what Engels has said, and choosing that as sort of doctrinal orthodoxy, I think, regardless of whether or not it is what Marx would have done, is the wrong way to think of things.
Yeah. Nathan from The Measures Taken, who I often butt heads with, who I often disagree with, even a lot. He did say, and I don't know who originally said this, or if it's his own invention, but he said that Friedrich Engels was the first revisionist, and I just really like that. Not so much because he disagreed with Marx, because you are allowed to disagree with people, but because if we interpret Marxism as what Marx thought, and everything has to comport with what Marx would have thought, if that's our contention, then yes, Engels very much revises. Key, if there's got to be a doctrine, then Engels is a revisionist. With when we talk about dialectics of nature, Hegel's contention is that the world can be grasped, that what Hegel's contention is that the mind of God can be grasped, and thus that everything in the universe can be understood. It's theoretically possible. That's what he calls absolute knowing. And when Lukács, when he argues that against Engels, that the dialectical method only applies to history and society, I think he's correct, and I think it's actually it's a part of the process of coming to know what happens in the world and why it happens, and thus the mind of the human mind, and thus the mind of God. It's all the same process. But if you don't think that that there is a mind of God, and that really you don't think the human mind matters at all, and everything is just an accidental process of untold eons of mindless evolution, then dialectics of nature is a decent place to start.
Well, so yeah, it's good to bring up Lukács, because Seymour delves into Lukács, and he's the one who begins this critique of Engels as the first revisionist, and argues with Marx against Engels, that Engels is kind of copy and pasting Hegel's logic to from Marx's Capital to the natural world. But he also quotes Lukács from a posthumously published writing addressing this very thing, which is basically saying that you can't actually overcome this by separating history from nature, because history is an extension of nature. So it's more like they're not. There's a dialectic that can't be understood in the same way in history and in nature, the way that Engels does.
Right. The problem with that is that philosophically, what that does is that it elevates human conception, elevates the collective unconscious, elevates the mind of the species to a higher level than rain, or whether or not they're a particular kind of tree in the area. It's like
hence proletarian idealism.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing, one small comment about Engels. I don't know if this is in defense of him or not, but worth pointing out, I guess, that evolutionary, like the concept of evolution in science is pretty old, but Darwinian evolution is very new when this is all going on. So I think I tend to see Engels is a very different thinker than Marx.
Yeah,
they're very aligned, obviously, but he's trying to do very different things, as I think dialectics of nature shows. And I don't know, I guess I can't really fault him to the same extent that some of the critics do, because I think he's very earnestly trying to fit in the new science, right? It's like these are all the new sciences. Like Marxism is the new science of history and class conflict. Darwinian evolution, perhaps poorly understood, is the new science. Hegel. So it's like trying to create this composite science out of all of these. And like, yeah, I guess it doesn't work, but like, I kind of respect the attempt.
Yeah, totally.
And he's probably, yeah, I see it more as like in hindsight, it's really easy to see how he's misusing the concepts. But I think for him, it maybe not be so apparent because, the thing with like evolution, it's Lamarckian evolution, right? That's like older than, and that's a purely idealism. Like nature has a teleology, and it's we should actually maybe look that up more to be more specific about it. But that's in marked distinction to Darwinian evolution, which is random and has no teleology.
Right, it's much more contingent.
Yeah. Right. So the problem is not that Engels is synthesizing all the newest sciences and trying to come up with something that harmonizes them. It's that unlike what you do with science is when it doesn't pan out in the way that was hypothesized, then you move past it and you try something else. Yeah. Rather than like what you do with revealed religion and become a fundamentalist of textual tradition, is where you insist upon the validity of the texts in the face of the changing science.
I love that. I love thinking of Orthodox Marxism as revealed religion.
Well, yeah.
Well, I mean, we talk about Marxism as secular Christianity all the time, mm-hmm. and I would say that like the vulgar materialists of all stripes, be they Stalinist or Orthodox Marxists or whatever, are the fundamentalists of this secular Christianity and the ones that are holding it back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a great point, because I think to tie in things from earlier, if we're talking about historical materialism or materialist conception of history, whatever the label is, it's like it's a way of viewing part of the problem, right? And it's not like evolutionary science where like we might get a better theory, scientific theory in 20 or 50 years that will better explain. It's like actually it does a pretty good job of explaining as is. Like we have an idea of class conflict through history and how social forces move. Like that's the theory. It's revealed.
Yeah. Like no further theorization is needed.
It's not this category as like our scientific tools of our instruments and tools of measuring the science lead us to a better theory of what's going on. So yeah, I think it's just like that particular moment. There's this category mistake is what I guess I would call Engels doing.
Well, what Saito on the shoulders of Lukács are alleging is that, according to Seymour, is that Engels is applying idealist categories in materialism and is resulting in a metaphysical incoherence. And so Seymour writes, Lukács argued against Engels that the dialectical method only applied to history and society. Only in history and society were such contraries as subject and object or theory and practice operative. However, this leads to a nature versus society dualism, which isn't fully addressed in the what's the magnum opus of Lukács in which he's doing this?
History and class consciousness.
Yeah. And so later on, the text I was referring to that was posthumously published in which he addresses this is that he says, society and nature must be conceived as a differentiated unity. Quote, identity of identity. Let me say, an identity of identity and non-identity, unquote, mediated by the concept of metabolism. They were the same but different, unitary but distinct. And so this is, I don't know, overcoming the overcoming or whatever.
Well, yeah, and like for any listener who finds that to be contradictory and hard to accept, of all of that is just seemingly contradictory and irreconcilable. That's also the nature of reality, according to the discipline of physics for the last at least century, maybe century and a half. That, like, at the subatomic level, there are laws that which apply, which are the exact. They're inverted on a larger scale. There's this seemingly irreconcilable, dualistic nature of reality, and yet reality, we still exist. We're still living right now, even if the things which apply that govern like Jupiter and asteroids are not applicable when we're talking about like electrons. All we're talking about here is just a philosophical rendition of that concept. It's actually not really it shouldn't be that hard to accept, even if it is a little bit hard to, so I'm trying not to say get your mind around, because we long
The
ago
mind
we
of
said
God? Get the mind of God around?
well, there's that.
No, it's rubbing the dry rub into your mind brisket.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what we've decided.
Because you can't, you don't, I don't remember
Your
why.
You can't wrap your head around anything, but you can. It's like, the dry rub. You rub it in your mind brisket, and a lot of it's going to fall off, but enough of it's going to get on there to be able to flavor your thoughts.
Exactly.
Nice. The mind's tempeh.
And that's all that matters, is having spicy thought flavors.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I wrote this note here it's for number 4 in this essay. I just wrote, Marx had not given up on Hegel after 1868. Saito's notion of an epistemological break is no more correct than that of Althusser. But I didn't explain it. So does anybody have thoughts on that? I feel like I took really undisciplined notes, which were really good when this was fresh on my mind, but that was like a month ago. So now
I think we have to.
What was I talking about?
We have to work our way to that, because that's the complexity of talking about this. Because we're going. Seymour's taking us into the thing that he's about to critique the critique of, and so sticking with this Lukácsian critique, Saito's saying Lukács is closer to Marx than Engels, right? And he's arguing that Lukács's and therefore Marx's methodological dualism is what enables the very identification of a metabolic rift between society and nature affected by capitalism. Okay, so that's Saito, right? But then Seymour says Saito's right and wrong. This part I think we have to go into. Seymour writes, either the dialectic, which is an objective principle in nature, is a dialectic in the philosophical sense of the back and forth movement of thought, idealism, or it is not really a dialectic at all, but just the law-like patterning of matter arising from dispositional properties like mass, charge, and spin, in which case the dialectic really does operate only in history, in parentheses, dualism. So, we're going into the critique that is necessary from Lukács and Saito, and we're going into the critique of that in Seymour.
But the reason why he's doing this is in the next paragraph, which is, he says, I am saying, Seymour, that the attempt at any dialectical explanation of any part of reality leads to this intractable problem if you think you are a materialist.
Yep.
So it's not a problem for us.
That's right.
This is only a problem if you are an intractable material metaphysical monist.
Yeah, it's only a problem if your conception of God is not triune.
Yeah.
If you're a Unitarian, this is a huge problem for you.
Yeah.
No, but I think the part of Lukács seems, I'm struggling to find what I can take from this, but I think this is what his point is that, in other words, I'm not sure if like Lukács's insights, or they may or may not be like relevant to whatever's going on right now. Oh, did we lose Chris?
No, we lost Chris.
Well, thankfully, it didn't change the recording, although it might change
His.
Chris's track.
No, I think it's okay. I think everything should line up. It doesn't look like anything was broken.
Fantastic.
That's good.
I don't know what y'all guys were talking about for the past minute and a half.
We were talking about how the essay just became very clear. We wrapped it all up.
Oh, damn. I was just going to say, I thought it was funny where when Lukács is accused of dualism, because that's clearly what he implies, he goes, I didn't mean to do that.
Oh, you mean Seymour? Yeah.
Huh?
You mean Lukács himself says that.
Lukács himself, when accused of committing a dualism, he goes, I didn't mean to do that. It's not what I was trying to do. Yeah. I have sort of like a soft spot for Lukács, even though I consider him to be intellectually dishonest. Like the second half of his work is tainted because of his need to fall in line with Stalinist orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So I like the first half of Lukács that he repudiates later a lot better than the second half. And I believe there's an epistemological break in Lukács.
Yeah.
And early Lukács would not have the problems that later Lukács comes up against. And the reason why he does what he didn't mean to do is because he doesn't actually think the things that he's writing.
Right. Like history and class consciousness is worthy of defense. But I think that Lukács is a defense of history and class consciousness, which is a book in itself, is not a good defense.
Yeah.
And Ben is gone.
Finally. Now let's start doing cool stuff.
Yeah. It's about time.
And I was saying earlier, I think when you were fading out, Chris, but that I think what Seymour is saying is like, it's not like the content of Lukács's philosophy and ideas are whatever. Like you're saying, you could take them or leave them. They're relevant or not for whatever moment.
Yeah.
But he's using him as an example to show that if you are claiming to do dialectics, i.e., are you a Marxist? You can't get around the problems that go beyond materialism, right? He's trying to say that idealism, what he's calling proletarian idealism, is very much a part of whatever this movement is. Otherwise, you're just doing what he says, not a dialectic at all, but just the law-like patterning of matter arising from dispositional properties like mass, charge, and spin.
Right.
Which is further complicated by what Jason was saying, which like quantum mechanics also blows that out of the water. So we can't even use that as an example anymore.
Yeah, quantum mechanics is proof, actually, of the highly contingent, highly variable, and somewhat chaotic, random nature.
Quit biting your brother.
Of
Sorry.
If there's a dialectic of nature, if there are dialectics of nature, they are to be identified only in the dualism, the dichotomy between the subatomic level and all things governed by what we now call quantum mechanics. And I don't know, what is the opposite of the subatomic? The larger scale. And that I feel like I really don't want to expound upon this too much because I'm going to get it a little bit wrong. But, there's the way that the human mind affects particles in terms of observation and so on. It's almost as though we mediate between these two rather distinct levels of reality. And again, I think I'm very comfortable with that because, like I said, my understanding of God is triune. And the Holy Spirit is very, very much that same mediator. It's that whatever. I'm not making this any more clear, but maybe less.
Yeah,
I got distracted because Eva's here. That's my niece and my goddaughter.
She pointed at you and said, "Dede," and then she looked at me like all confused.
We don't look that similar.
No, but she confuses us. If I show her pictures of you, she goes, "Dede, Dede."
Well,
no, that's Uncle Jason.
What about without glasses?
It's Uncle Jason.
I mean,
Sorry, she was calling for me because she hurt her fingers, and so I'll bring her in. All right.
To continue with the science metaphor, just for one more minute, maybe a way to think about this in general is, or something I think about, it's like how quantum physics and Newtonian physics both apply, right? But in different ways and often contradictory.
Yes.
Like how we think of gravity in terms of Newtonian physics works as a science and worked for hundreds of years and still does work at the same time as quantum physics, which directly contradict almost all of the presuppositions, also works as a science. Both of them hold at the same time. And one could imagine many other sciences operating at the same time with the same level of scientific truth and accuracy, which just kind of like goes to this point of like, it doesn't have to be dualistic or a dichotomy for all these overlapping things to be true. I think maybe that's part of the broader point. Maybe Seymour's not saying this explicitly, but I think that is absolutely true about Marx's philosophy. And materialist conception of history is like, it can be one way. Like, why does it have to be a cosmological answer to like, we were talking about this with like Herbert McCabe and Terry Eagleton. Like, why does Marxism have to answer the question of what does it mean to be human? Maybe it doesn't.
It's good that it doesn't, because first of all, it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't try to answer the question. So thankfully, we don't need it to, because if we needed it to, then we would have to contend with the reality that it doesn't.
Right.
Well,
we'd wind up with something like that. Remember that Marxist futurist article that we read by some
is the
Irish Marxist? What's his name?
Bertel Ullman? Is that right? No, that's not right.
No, I don't remember. No. We read it. We talked about it with Donald, and it was his vision of the future where we can all shed our human bodies and just like exist in metal cylinders that float around in space and stuff.
J.D. Bernal.
There we go. Yeah, that was J.D. Bernal. In which, like, I remember Donald said he thought it was a pretty cool article, and like just being able to dream about the future like that. And I just thought every single word of it was horrifying to the extreme.
It was very much not okay. And also, and if you're trying to do this, you go beyond just even J.D. Bernal and that kind of a thought experiment, which is horrifying for some of us anyways. It's also when we talk about so like Lysenkoism is a good example of when you try to take this philosophical clothing that Marx's political methods were wrapped in, and we say everything is that, and that is an explanation for everything. Lysenkoism is regarded rightfully, I would say now, as a criminal stupidity.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds like the version of whatever. What do we call that? Communist futurism that you might pitch to a Mormon. You know, the floating. Sorry, Mormons. But regarding all this discussion of quantum mechanics, I wanted to return to kind of a summation or a summary of Hegel's method. Seymour writes that Hegel's dialectical categories applied specifically to the logical operations of reason. He followed Kant in arguing that reason is concept generating, that these concepts tend toward ever-increasing comprehensiveness, and that this eventually leads to an unconditioned totality, an absolute, outside of which there is nothing. But whereas Kant claimed that there was a world beyond reason, a thing in itself that could not be known, for Hegel, the entire world could be overgrasped. Übergreifen, are you okay? By reason.
Yep.
Because it had a mind-like structure. Or rather, it was nothing but mind. So all of this, I think, is very simpatico with what you were talking about just earlier.
There is a little bit of Hegel's Hermeticism coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, you brought up Ullman. Seymour takes aim at Ullman and another dialectician named Murray Smith, who I'm not familiar with. And just kind of describes how their attempts to overcome ontological dualism, even he says they're not successful, but even if they were, would not be materialist. They would not be on materialist grounds. They would necessarily be ontologically idealist. And this is, because what we've already said, that any dialectical explanation leads you into trouble if you try and do it as a materialist monist. I thought that was relevant. Was that unnecessary?
No, that was good. And also, it you force us back into the text, which is it's worth doing, actually.
We don't have to answer it right in this moment, but maybe with a view toward where Seymour is going with the ecological frame. I guess one of my questions is, why does materialism pose such a threat to how we think about these things, right? I think that's part of why this article exists.
Yeah, right.
Because he's asking that within the ecological and degrowth contexts, there's a lot of metaphysical monism and materialism. And I think part of the project he's trying to do is carve out space for more than that. And I mean, not to answer it too preemptively, but he talks at the end about freedom, which he argues, and I think I would agree, that are there any grounds for a philosophy of freedom and human action within a purely materialist worldview?
He says no.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm enough of an existentialist to agree. And it actually made me think about Sartre at the end, because for Sartre, freedom and consciousness is not being, being is substance and static and frozen. And so there's an interesting dualism or dichotomy between being and not being, which doesn't mean dead or not alive. It just means consciousness and freedom is not a thing that can be static or pinned down.
Or to be Hegelian about it, we could say that it is a process of becoming. It's that if being is a static thing and you move from one mode of being by virtue of your, let's call it free will, your freedom, and that enables you to step out of one mode of being and into another mode of being. The process of transitioning from one mode of being to another mode of being, like this transition from slavery to freedom, is an action. It's a series of actions. It's a process. And that the freedom itself is actually this process itself. So the application of the process is that's actually how you transition from one being to another being.
But actually, Seymour says being isn't static. He says social being is, in fact, itself conscious action.
Well, I mean, but it's not as though we apply consciously. I'm about to transition from my being to another state of being. It's always in motion.
Yeah.
Right.
But the state of being is not in motion. The transition from one state of being to another is in motion, constantly, at all times.
Well, maybe that's a distinction between being and social being.
I want to read well, hold on. This is, number 5. I put, the internal relations between concepts can only be motivated and generated through the self-development of spirit. It requires a logical and teleological structure, which unites all elements in an organic totality. History possesses a rational structure in which messy tendencies are actualized in real social processes. Then I put in parentheses, incidentally, this is Hegel's view. Since society emerged from nature, how can a rational process be at work which was not at least latent in nature? And then I don't know if this is in the article or not, I put, since successive forms of social being are supposed to possess an innate self-moving rationality, they are in fact actualizations of the idea, capital idea.
Yeah.
That's a idealist as hell.
Yeah, and just earlier, the portion I was pointing to, that social being is itself conscious action, he goes on to say, changing the order of determinations, to social consciousness determining the concrete or whatever, doesn't alter the fact that the identity of being and consciousness is idealist. And since the successive forms of social being are supposed to possess an innate self-moving rationality, they are in fact actualizations of the idea.
Yeah.
So what we presume to be the sort of foundations of our our materialism are impossible without idealism.
Right. I think what Seymour has done with this essay is reassert in a very bold way what it actually means to think and apply your thinking in a what we'll say Marxist manner, and that what people typically for the last several decades now think of as Marxism is precisely what Marx was referring to when he said, "One thing is certain is that I am no Marxist."
Yeah.
This actually just made me think of something. I saw today some anti-Semitic thread on responding to like some Instagram post about Marxism, talking about how Marxism is essentially like an offshoot of Judaism and is run by the Jew. The Marxists were all Jews, etc. And then someone said, "Don't forget that the anti-Semitism that is ingrained in Marxism," and then they put in parentheses the doctor's plot. And I just thought about how stupid all of these people were, and then I thought about how the way that most these people think about Marxist orthodoxy is exactly the way that a lot of Stalinists and other, vulgar materialists think about Marxist orthodoxy. So they have the same understanding of Marxism that these like complete dimwits on Twitter or Instagram, whatever, one of those, it was Instagram, the same understanding of Marxism that these people do.
Yeah. And that reminds me of the mutually reinforcing false identity of Marxism from the Cold War between Stalinism and anti-communism.
Right.
And outside of ideology and philosophy, but in realpolitik as well. Like from a Cold War perspective, the Red Scare got a lot of things right.
Well, that's sort of the logical endpoint of a lot of third campist logic.
Yeah. It's actually, I mean, that's part of why I no longer see myself as a third campist, even if I am very sympathetic with whatever, with the origins. On to point number 6, I think. How do we feel about this? I guess Ben has been kind of leading this, so maybe it's just let Ben continue to decide where we are.
Well, this is where Daniel was taking us about the discourse of human freedom.
Right.
I have one more. I have a thought to bridge the two sections, I think. But go ahead. Well, I was trying to think of where I just saw this. I think it's actually in the Balabar book, to go back to that. But to tie back in Sartre and existentialism, Balabar is mentioning in this book that to go back to this question of what is historical materialism, for Sartre, it was the passage in Marx in the 18th Brumaire that people make their own history, but not as they please.
Right.
And I think it's the twinning of both, right? The idealism part is the freedom to make your own history. The materialism part is but not as they please.
Yeah.
And it's both of them at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's that idea of, you can call it material conditions, or Sartre calls it the situation. It's the contingencies or determinisms that place you in a certain moment, your limitations even. That's like the given of where you find yourself, personally, individually, but also as a society. But the whole point of Marxism is the freedom to do with those conditions, as it's like the ball's in your court. Now what?
Yeah.
But
Incidentally,
we're always in that situation.
Incidentally, this is a kind of I don't want to call it a debate, a discussion. It's an ongoing, it's a debate between me and my partner, because she talks about free will and about how that's a ludicrous category. She talks about determinism. And maybe it's just because I am too wed to the concept of free will. I want to defend it. And so she often, but in my defense of it, she says, well, you're like a soft determinist. So I've been reading into this a little bit. And I was like, actually, you know what? I am a soft determinist because men make history, but not in circumstances of their choosing. Very much so.
Yep. Sound like St. Thomas Aquinas there.
Yeah.
I could think of a worse people
or Marx.
sound like.
No, but this is a real point. I mean, if you're going to get like at least one sector of conservatives on your side as Marxists, this is one. Like,
yeah,
people have limitations. We operate from a place of contingency and also free will. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good starting place.
Right.
Yeah.
We can get the Thomists on our side.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
and it is, in fact, things are determined, and also we have free will in the same way that there are different laws that govern different levels of material reality, and there's this dualism, which is bridged by a, let's call it an idea, by a willpower, by a spirit, I'm increasingly coming to realize and to recognize that this is just the nature of everything is triune. So is God.
And freedom, as Seymour says, is the actualization of the idea. The idea, the spirit, is the route out of one's self-determinism. There's this passage at the end I think is worth reading together. He says, I think ecological thought correctly intuits that its subject is freedom, that metaphysical materialism is nihilistic and cannot ground freedom, or indeed any value, that is to say, social and historical desire, that is resistant to the plunder and destruction of material plenitude for the sake of evanescent abstractions like shareholder value. Its only coherent move with respect to desire is to defer the question and adopt an agnostic pluralism in which all desires can and should be satiated with more commodities, or eliminate the problem by treating it as a false inner representation of a mechanical or machine-like process. This is the bit that's really important. It renders any commitment to the flourishing of future generations, solidarity with dispossessed humanity, and the survival of the species ethically voluntarist. Nor can it even ground the intelligibility of the world. Any coherence between thought and reality, any over-grasping of the real by reason, would be entirely fortuitous from its perspective, and likely an evolved primate illusion, leaving the real world, the thing in itself, utterly beyond our grasp. So
according to Seymour, you're either going to be Hegelian in your thought, or else you're all just neo-Kantians.
Yeah, and I think I was trying to, there's a couple more recent public articles on his Patreon where he talks about degrowth. I think part of the implicit critique he's doing here too is to the degrowth side as well, saying this is where I only have a very superficial, I've not read very deeply in a lot of that literature, but know enough of it. But it spans a lot of philosophical and political spectrum, this idea of degrowth. There's obviously degrowth communists, but I think he's also pushing back against that world, the sort of common assumptions that have been made there, is even in terms of, I don't know, what he was saying about the treating it as a false representation, a mechanical machine-like process. There's also kind of I think I would be comfortable calling it an apocalypticism. That's sort of like, well, if things just keep going on, we'll run out of resources, and then we're all fucked. And it's like that also leaves out the freedom to think about things differently, and it also leaves open the question of what is the goal in the future we're going toward. And some of his other critiques of degrowth, I've seen that where not degrowth as a concept, but just like in kind of the common parlance, the terms and shorthands that are being used in terms of, it's like, well, we're all coming together to live a more like satisfied, good life without stuff. It's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah. I mean,
that's also materialist, kind of, like if you don't define it without the idea.
That sort of communist nihilist sort of end notes tendency where everything is premised on a overdetermined collapse. I think we have been misunderstood. Dialectical pessimism has been misunderstood as that in the past, and I don't think that's exactly where we reside.
No, I mean, we joke around a lot about the end of the world because it's very easy to conceive of the end of the world and how we might not be able to save humanity before the end of the world. And I do think that it is possible that there would be a collapse that we have to deal with before we ever get the chance to create the proletarian utopia of the future. But I don't think it's like, I think it's going to be an ecological collapse that leads to a societal collapse, which will be a lot more devastating than I think the end notes people would have us believe is necessary for creating a new communist society. But yeah, we're certainly not like accelerationist in any way.
Well, I don't want to speak for Kevin, so.
Well, yeah, Kevin might be, yeah.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, и труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.